He was a very easy man to live with. He was very kind, very gentle, very good-natured. He never fired anybody from a job, no matter how bad they were. The closest he came was one technician who was really unbelievable, because at that point Mac was going out of town a lot because he had to speak here and there and the other place, and he had responsibilities other than at the university. And he would always leave his technician with instructions of what he wanted done while he was gone. And I'd be sitting there and I'd hear him leaving the instructions. And this gal would wait till he left. She'd come into me and she'd say, I know she was a Southern belle from Kentucky. And I know he told me to do something, but I have no idea what it was. But he didn't fire her anyway. She never did anything. But this was the closest he came to firing anybody, because she told him she was engaged and she was going to have to go back to Kentucky. And he said, oh, okay, you know. And 2 weeks later, she told him that her engagement was broken and she could stay after all. And he said, oh, he was sorry, he had made other arrangements. That was the closest he ever came to firing anybody. He just couldn't do it. He was that kind of a human being. By the time the book came along, he really was working very hard on it. He decided he should write it, since neither Avery nor MacLeod had written up the work, except for the scientific papers. And so he started working on the book. And I was reading it along with while he was writing. And at first, somebody told him that there was some fund that was giving money to scientific writers. But they gave him $5,000 to write the book, and then they decided that they would like, as Mac put it, they would like to have the book, but they wanted somebody else to write it. So that didn't go over very big with him. And he told them no thanks. And then Lewis Thomas was chairman of a new committee that the Margaret Mahoney had started at the, the Commonwealth Fund. And she started this committee for books. And she liked the book, and Lou Thomas liked, you know, the first chapters, whatever was written. They both liked it. And so they talked to the committee, and they said they would like for this to be their first book from the Commonwealth Fund. And that's how the book came about. And actually, Lou Thomas and Mac were very good friends, because they had been postdocs together here at Rockefeller long before my time. So they knew each other very well. And the other people on the committee all agreed. And that's how the book came about. And he worked very hard on that book. He wanted to make it something that people could read who didn't have the scientific background. And some could and some couldn't, but I think he did a good job, but that's just my prejudice. And we got the proofs. Oh, I forgot to mention that Mac was not fit to live with if he didn't have a Paris fix at least once a year. He really loved Paris, and he loved going there. So we went every year. And just one year, just as we were leaving at Christmas time, we always went at Christmas time, because I always had a better vacation time then. You know, I only had 23 days a year, and I had to think carefully where I was going to go with him. So we always went at Christmas, where we had an extra week. And the day we were leaving, just before the leaving for the plane, the proofs came in. So we took them to Paris with us, and we proofread in this lovely little inn in Paris where Marcello Mastroianni stayed. And he was always on the telephone in the lobby, and we were sitting in the lobby reading proof. It was an interesting situation. But we did get all the proofs read, and the book got published, and there it is. Yeah, how about that? I think it's still in print.
Yep.
It's very nice. But he kept getting more recognition, and people like Josh Lederberg kept fighting for him to get more recognition because people knew that Watson and Crick would never have done their work if Avery, McLeod, and McCarty had not shown that DNA was the genetic material. But Mac never pushed, he never said a word about feeling bad that he didn't get this or that or the other. He never talked about that. Dr. Lederberg put him up for the Nobel Prize every single year. Even after Avery died, he kept putting Mac up because he knew that Mac was actually the biochemist on the team, and that was important. The other two were microbiologists, as was Mac, but he had majored in biochemistry at Stanford as an undergraduate at a time in the early 30s, late 20s, when Stanford had one professor of microbiology, of biochemistry, for all the medical school and the graduate school. So, and he managed to get in the class for the biochemistry. He really was interested in that. I'm trying to think. Actually, when he had decided at age 10, according to what his mother told me, that he wanted to be a doctor, but he wanted to be a doctor in research. And she encouraged him. Nobody had gone to college in his family before. And she made sure that he had chemistry sets in the basement and God knows what, all sorts of things. And he decided he had to take French and Latin because he wanted to go to Stanford undergraduate, and he wanted to go to Hopkins to medical school because he'd read someplace that Hopkins was where you went if you wanted to be in research. So he decided that's where he needed to go. And he read all those things, what they required. One of the things that Hopkins required, mind you, he was in high school at the time. One of the things that Hopkins required was a reading knowledge of French and German. And this, mind you, was right after World War I, when the Germans were not very popular, especially not in the Middle West or Middle East, whatever, in Indiana, where he went to school at that time. And so he found a Lutheran minister across town from where he lived, and he went there every day after school to learn German, to prepare for Hopkins. I mean, he knew what he wanted, and he always did know what he wanted. And even much later, he always knew what he wanted.
Amazing.
It really was amazing when you think, and I mean, this didn't come from him. His mother told me this. So.
You travel a lot, right?
We traveled a lot because he was very much in demand for advice and consent in different places because they knew what his background was and what he could do. One of the places that we got introduced to a doctor by some of our colleagues who was in Cairo and who ran a lab that everybody said was the only thing in Egypt that resembled a real good lab. And so he was invited to come and visit. And we had been on a trip to Greece with his next younger brother. I didn't go through his family, I'll do that later. His next younger brother, who was an architect, and his wife. And we'd gone to Greece together. And we added on a little trip to Cairo to see Aziz. And Aziz convinced Mac to chair a committee, an advisory committee for this rheumatic fever lab. Rheumatic fever was a big problem in Egypt, probably still is. And strep disease is, to do with rheumatic fever. So he agreed to do this, and he organized some of the people in the strep field from all over the country here. And they set up a committee, and they were an advisory committee. And Aziz ran a lab. I don't know how much you know about Egypt, but the part of the Muslim practice is you have to wash your feet 7 times a day or whatever, I don't know. And Aziz set up this lab, and he said he paid everybody more than the other labs, but he said there'll be no washing your feet in this lab. This is a laboratory to do work, and you need to do the work and never mind the feet washing. And it wasn't that Aziz wasn't a practicing Muslim, he was. So Mac thought, well, this was a good sign. I mean, this was obviously, he was a serious person in this kind of work, and he was. So we got to Egypt 6 times. And since Mac knew that they didn't have any dollars in Egypt at that time, and probably still don't. And so we paid our own airfare to get over there. But they gave us a little trip around Egypt because they had plenty of Egyptian money. So each time we went, we had a slightly different trip around Egypt. And that was really very interesting and worth the price of admission. Yeah, he was very close. There were 4 boys in his family. And they were all very close to each other. In fact, after his mother didn't die till she was 93 or so. And the boys continued. She used to get us all together at least once a year. She lived in Winter Park, Florida, but she would take us all to Sarasota. And I didn't mention that his father had been a clerk at Studebaker when his parents were married. His mother had worked there as well. And they met and they married. And then he ended up being president of Nash Motors from being a clerk at Studebaker. So he rose pretty fast in the ranks. But they lived in a lot of different places because every time he got a promotion, that he had to be head of something in a different city. So he started school in Oregon, and his older brother started school in Texas, and he started school in Oregon. And then they went back to Kenosha, and it was in Oregon that he was in the 2nd grade, in one of these collapsible schools in a suburb of of Portland, and he was always busy watching. They had six grades in one class with one teacher, and he was in second grade, and he was always watching what the kid next to him was doing in third grade, and finally he got promoted to third grade because he was, able to do it. So, but then he went to Kenosha to school, and then he ended up in South Bend, where he'd been born, and went to high school there. And I may be mixing up Kenosha and South Bend, but it doesn't matter. And he applied. His family moved back to Oregon when he was graduating from high school. And the only school he applied to, the only college he applied to, was Stanford. And he got in. And then when he was at Stanford and graduating from there, he applied to Hopkins, and his professor at Stanford said, "Why don't you come to our medical school? It's cheaper than Hopkins." And he didn't care. He was going to Hopkins. And he got in, but it was the only place, not like today's kids where they have to apply to 1,000,000 places. He applied to one for each. Of course, he was a good student, so he got into whatever he applied to. So to get back on track, he went to Hopkins to medical school, and he got married the first time when he was a first-year medical student. And his parents were very supportive of him because he was the first person in his family to ever go to college. And his father was very, very proud of him. Unfortunately, his older brother was a manic depressive, and Mac always said that, and his mother said the same, that his older brother was smarter than he was, but he just couldn't function. And the two younger brothers, were both in Who's Who in America at the same time Mac was. One was the architect, the one who was 10 years younger than Mac, and the one who was 12 years younger than Mac was a banker, and he was head of some banks upstate, a whole bunch of banks. And he didn't like banking, but he was able to retire when he was 55 and do his own thing. But they were all achievers, those four boys, well, three of the four anyway. And the architect had gone to Princeton, Mac went to Stanford, the architect went to Princeton, and the banker went to Harvard. So they were all very capable. But they also had very supportive parents who encouraged them to do what they wanted to do, which is, not many parents can do that. So then when he finished medical school, he continued to do his residency at Hopkins, and he did his internship there, and he was a resident in pediatrics at Hopkins because he wanted to work with infectious diseases, and that was really most important to children. So that was what he specialized in, was infectious diseases. And then he wanted to come to Rockefeller, and he applied for one job. It was really not in his field at all, and he didn't get it, somebody else did. And then he applied for another job here, I guess he took a job at NYU where he was for 1 year, with one of the people there who actually had worked with Avery and knew Avery. And he was getting $100 a month in a fellowship from the federal government, which was the only kind of fellowship that existed then, and that was it, you know. And so his family was still supporting him. Luckily, they were in a position to support him without any problem. And he was with, oh God, I forget the name now of the fellow at NYU. Maybe it'll come to me, maybe it won't. But anyway, he recommended, he applied for the fellowship for a second year, and they said that they'd be happy to give it to him, but he needed to go to a different place other than NYU, because and they suggested he go to Rockefeller. And so the fellow he was working with was very insulted, but he said, that's all right, if they want you to go, I'll call Avery. And so he called Avery, and Avery was delighted to have Mac come to him. You know, it was all very interesting. It was totally different times than today. And by that time, he had a wife and 2 children. So, you know, but he still, his parents support, well, his mother supported him. His father died when he was very young. He had retired already, but they were living in Florida. But he really had a bad heart. Actually, that heart ran through his father's family. And of course, by the time Mac got it, he got a triple bypass, and he went on for another, God knows how many years, and 23 years after that, because things had improved in that. And his next younger brother, the architect, had the same heart problem, and he just died a couple of years ago, you know. And the youngest brother just died this year. But they all did very well. All super achievers. He was really very happy to have Mac come to him. And he arrived in September. I think he tells about this in the book. He arrived in September, and Avery wasn't there. He was still up in Maine at his summer place. And so Mac did a lot of reading what was going on. And then Avery came, and he invited Mac to work with him on the DNA stuff. And they would work in the lab together. And they had an agreement that nobody would open the experiments that they had done the day before until they were both there, could look at them together, which they did. But Colin McLeod and Mac never worked together. They knew each other well, but Colin went to NYU. As a matter of fact, the people from the group that gave him the fellowship, they wrote to him saying that they were awarding the fellowship, but they would like for him to switch from NYU and go to work with Colin McLeod at Rockefeller. What they didn't know was that Colin McLeod was going to NYU that year, and so Mac and Colin never worked together. But he came to Avery, and Avery was very happy to have him. And they worked together like that for, well, let's see, he came in 41, Yeah, and they published the paper in 44. Oh, well, what happened was that there was a man whose name escapes me at the moment because I never really got to know him, who ran the lab on streptococcal diseases, and he was retiring. And so Mac got offered that. The president then was the one before Bronk, Gasser, and he offered Mac the headship of that department. And since that was right up his alley with the patients and the whole business, you know, all part of clinical investigation, which he really wanted to do. So he took that, and so he didn't work on the DNA work afterwards. He worked on the strep and rheumatic fever. And he had patients here with rheumatic fever. A lot of rheumatic fever in those days. And he was part of the group that established that rheumatic fever came from strep disease. In fact, one of his patients was David Rockefeller Jr., who had rheumatic fever. And as Mac describes it was before my time, as Mac describes it, he was the earliest diagnosed rheumatic fever patient that Mac had ever seen. And he was diagnosed by Peggy Rockefeller's sister, who was a physician, and who diagnosed that. And so Mac had all of the Rockefeller children in for testing their throats to make sure they didn't have strep throats and so on. But they were all here. And David was here for quite a while. And he and Mac used to exchange limericks. And he saved some of them. I think I sent them up to the archives. But they really had a good time together. And Peggy used to come in every day to see David, and she and Mac would chat. And so he got to be pretty friendly with them, too.
What about you? You met David? No, I mean...
I met David much later. And I met Peggy, too. That was after we were married. Oh, I thought they were wonderful people. They first of all, I think David had the most incredible memory. He remembered everybody's name and who they were. And, you know, he met a lot of people, not just here, but all over. But he always knew who was whom. I never saw him hesitate. In fact, one time we met in Cairo when Mac was there and David was there for another meeting, and at that time they were still having problems in Egypt, and they had a lot of security at the big hotels. And we were coming home one night from dinner with our colleagues, and David was in the limousine just ahead of our car, which was not a limousine. And Mac saw him get out of the car, and he jumped out to go say hello to David. And David got excited when he saw Mac, and he ran back. And the guards came jumping in. They didn't know what was going on. They had to be reassured that they were friends. He retired, he became emeritus, but he still came every day that he was able to. And I used to help him come because he was not in great physical shape. He was fine mentally, but his physical shape wasn't that terrific. But he had his heart surgery when he was, I forget. It was pretty late. He must have been close to 80. So he was emeritus by then, because he was a strong believer that he should retire at 70 because you have to make room for the young people. And he would never push himself to stay longer than he was entitled to. He was a very principled man, and no matter what, he stuck to his principles.